is pick up the phone and dial 0345 6060 973. The lines are open now. All previous episodes of the programme are on the Cross Question podcast, and this show will appear there before midnight tonight. Well, it's time to introduce our panel. I'm joined in our Westminster studio by the former Treasury and Foreign Office Minister and Conservative MP Harriett Baldwin, and Peter Cardwell, who's just written a book called The Secret Life of Special Advisors. Got an interview with him on my All Talk podcast right at the moment. And also joining us by wonders of modern technology are Labour's Shadow Treasury Minister Pat McFadden and Miatta Fahnbulleh from the New Economics Foundation. And welcome to you all. Well, let's crack on. Let's go to our first question. It's from Nathan in Salford. Nathan, what would you like to ask?
Hi, I'm a teacher and my partner's a police officer, and obviously we, and along with all public sector workers, have still been working really hard throughout the pandemic. And while we are very fortunate that that's the situation we were in, I'm just wondering if the panel think it's fair or right that we should take, a pay cut to pay everything off, or as it looks at the moment.
Harriett Baldwin, former Treasury Minister.
Well, thank you, Nathan, and I certainly hope that MPs don't get a pay rise, and I've written to our regulator to request that we get our pay frozen. And I think the Chancellor today, in an environment where inflation is very, very low, sort of made the right judgment call on public sector pay by saying that over half the public sector would get a pay increase. So everyone with pay under 24,000 would see their pay increase this year. But he made the difficult decision, again, with inflation very, very low, to say that people paid more than that in the public sector would not get a pay rise. And I certainly hope MPs fall into that category.
But when you look at the amount of money that was promised for the defence budget last week, lots of other initiatives, it does seem a little bit pernickety not to give public sector pay workers at least a very modest pay rise.
Yeah, and I think the majority of them will get a modest pay rise. Anyone under 24,000 a year will get at least, I think it's £250. So I think that's the right judgment in an environment where obviously we are spending far, far more than we are expecting to receive in taxes next year.
Is it right, though, and this is a difficult one, is it right for doctors who are, at the moment, most people would say reasonably well remunerated, is it right for them to get a pay rise? Obviously, they've worked incredibly hard during the pandemic, but is it right for them to get a pay rise when they might be on sometimes a six-figure salary, someone like Nathan, who obviously is not?
I think everyone will agree that they're very pleased that the people who've worked so hard this year within our NHS are getting a pay rise, that those who are under 24,000 a year will get a pay rise. And the Chancellor laid bare today the shape of the public finances. Inflation is very, very low. So in real terms, having a freeze this year is very minor. And I certainly hope that MPs are the ones who have their pay frozen.
Pat McFadden, it's very easy in opposition to say, well, of course, the government should spend more. But in the end, if you aspire to be a government, you would have had to make these same decisions as well. Do you think you would have come to a different conclusion?
Yeah, I do. I think this is a mistake for two reasons. One, I think it's unfair because our public services have had to work very hard this year. I mean, Nathan said he was a teacher, his partner was a police officer. Let's take both of those as an example. Teachers have had to adapt to a whole new different way of working, trying to teach children online right throughout the hard period of lockdown, and then cope with the school return from September. And we've really regarded, quite rightly, schools as an essential service throughout this, because children's education has really suffered this year. Police officers the same. They're having to cope with trying to encourage the public to obey ever-changing sets of rules, and that's not been easy during the year. So firstly, I think it's unfair, but secondly, I think it's unwise, because next year, what's our big task going to be after, assuming things go well with the vaccine? Our big task is going to be getting the economy moving again. And to hit demand by hitting people's pay and reducing their spending power, millions of them in the public sector, doesn't seem a good contribution to getting the economy going again. So I think on both of those grounds, we would have taken a different view of the public sector pay issue today.
Miatta Fahnbulleh, Harriett says, well, inflation's very low, so this will have a minor effect. A lot of people listening who work in the private sector will say, well, public sector workers generally have much better job security than we do. We aren't getting a pay rise this year. In fact, if we're on furlough, we've had a 20% pay cut. We fear for our jobs. Everyone would love a pay rise, but in these economic circumstances, could it really be justified to have a blanket rise across the public sector?
Well, I mean, inflation is due to be 2% next year, so we're actually looking at a real pay cut for the public sector workers. And the key thing for me is that it comes off the back of 10 years in which we've seen huge pay constraint in the public sector, where we've seen real pay term cuts or freezes. And, you know, the central point is we said at the start of this pandemic that our key workers are the backbone of our communities. They've kept us going, and that we owe them a debt of gratitude. We also said that actually for the vital work they do for us, we don't pay them enough, you know. And for me, the classic example is social care, where actually some of our social care workers are doing some of the most vital work looking after our loved ones, are barely paid the living wage, and in some instances not the minimum wage. So the idea that we would further compress and push down their pay feels like completely the wrong call, in my opinion, particularly when you put it against the economics, which is that we need to be, as Pat said, stimulating the economy. The analysis that we have done at NEF suggests that actually if we were looking at a pay rise, say 2%, that would boost the economy by about 1 billion to 2 billion in the next year. We need to stoke the economy, therefore contracting pay is not the right economic call.
Peter Cardwell, obviously everyone would love to give everyone a pay rise. We'd all love a pay rise. Everyone listening would like to have a pay rise. But in your view, coming from a background as a special advisor to cabinet ministers, what are the political dangers here for the government?
I think this would be economically and politically impossible to say in the unprecedented crisis that we're in terms of coronavirus, but also the huge crisis economically that is only starting, as Rishi Sunak said today, that if we give everybody a pay rise in the public sector, as you pointed out earlier, the private sector would say, well, what about us? And we've had a really, really tough time. Many people have lost their jobs. Many people sadly will. And I think this was a dose of economic reality from Rishi Sunak today, despite the fact that he is going to be borrowing a huge amount and putting, far more into the economy than was previously forecast.
A lot of money, we've seen various reports from the National Audit Office, various other institutions, that they've wasted tens of billions of pounds on all sorts of different things over the past 8 months. And yet it's public sector workers who are going to pay the penalty for that, because that money now isn't there to pay them the money that they think they're due.
I think everybody is going to pay the price for the economic circumstances in which we find ourselves because of coronavirus. Mistakes, of course, were made around PPE, for example. Politically, there were a lot of very balanced decisions made today. I'm sure we'll talk about foreign aid at some point in this discussion as well.
We will.
Yes.
Harriett Baldwin, one of the government's main things is to so-called level up, particularly in the so-called red wall seats. Well, if you're a public sector worker in Halifax, you're not going to be very impressed by this, are you?
I thought one of the points that was worth highlighting was the fact that actually in today's statement, the Chancellor did increase the national living wage by 2.2%. So he did make that point that those who are on the lowest pay ought to see an inflation-busting rise in this environment. So
what was it, 22 pence, going up to £8.91?
Nearly £9 now. So, I mean, that has gone up very, very significantly over the last few years. And I think that's recognising the fact that if you can help those on the lowest pay in the private sector, that you end up with, as Pat was rightly saying, money that will be spent in the economy. And so I think that's an important point.
Pat McFadden, we haven't really heard anything from Labour today, apart from saying the government should do more. I'm unclear as to what Labour would be doing in these circumstances, apart from saying, well, we wouldn't want to start from here.
What you've got to do in these circumstances is combine good virus management with good economic management. One of the problems of this discussion over the last 6 months has been this internal debate in the government about should we prioritise the virus or should we prioritise the economy? You've actually got to do both to do this, because you can't get your economy moving again unless you get the virus under control. So if you ask me what would Labour be doing, I think putting maximum effort into the public health side of this to try to control the virus. And we do have some light on the horizon. We've had some very exciting announcements about vaccines in recent weeks, with British science at the forefront of those. That's fantastic. And once you've done that, your priority has to be to try to get the economy moving and recover from this. Because for all the debate about spending and borrowing and taxation, ultimately it's economic growth, getting people back to work, getting business moving again, that will make the biggest difference to our economic future.
Peter.
But Pat, that is a point that is, very general. I mean, what is it? Would you be in more debt than £400 billion? Would you be spending more than £280 billion as a result of that? I mean, Labour, Annalise Dodds, the Shadow Chancellor, stood up today and said, well, we would do things differently, but I'm just not clear on the specifics. Could you let us know what they are?
Look, it would be a completely absurd response to that question for me to say we'd be borrowing £385.5 billion. That's not how this crisis works. The Chancellor has had to borrow throughout the course of the year to fund interventions which have only happened once in 100 years. The figures he gave today on borrowing made that clear, the exceptional nature of the situation. The drop in GDP makes that clear. So, to be honest, it's a bit facile and glib to say exactly how much would you borrow. You would borrow enough at the moment.
But you haven't said anything concrete about what differently you would do, apart from warm words, Pat, with respect.
Well, that's fine. But what I'm saying is what we would do is support the economy through this phase and then do what we can to get the economy moving afterwards. And I'm sorry I can't give you the PSBR exact figure on that. But the truth is, if you'd asked the Chancellor to do the same thing a few months ago, neither could he have done. We're in a once-in-a-100-year situation, and that's the way that we've got to...
Okay. All right, let's go back to our caller, Nathan. Nathan, do you understand the reasons that you're not going to get a pay rise?
I've always understood them. I mean, like I said at the beginning, we're quite fortunate that it's not the end of the world for us, but there are families out there who it would be the end of the world for. I suppose with me, the sticking point is why are the public sector workers being forced to pay for mistakes made by the government when, yes, there will be mistakes made with PPE and other things, but when you're dealing with that amount of money, more than one, which there have been, is just not acceptable. And obviously we've now got to foot the bill for that. And that just doesn't seem right. I know it's got to happen, but it's just not right.
Okay, Nathan, thank you very much. Darius in Sutton has got a question for us. Darius, hi.
Good evening. Does the panel agree that cutting aid will be to the detriment of the British economy and power and influence, particularly in Commonwealth and Third World countries?
Pat McFadden, I suspect the answer to this question from you is yes.
Yeah, for a few reasons. This is something that had bipartisan support for many years. I saw former Prime Minister David Cameron on the news a couple of hours ago making clear his opposition to this decision. It's also very much not in line with what we should be doing during a pandemic. This is a global health crisis. If we don't try to help other countries handle this pandemic, the truth is it can come back onto our own shores. We've learned how vulnerable we are globally through this, even though many of the responses have been quite national in nature. And there's a third reason why I think it's a mistake, which is particularly in the post-Brexit environment, we were supposed to be global Britain, and we became a bit less global today because in this area we have exercised very well-respected global leadership in terms of promoting education for the poorest children in the world, clean water, sanitation, better healthcare for some of the poorest in the world. And today we put forward, or the Chancellor put forward, quite a big cut in that. So I think
We'll
that's
still
a
be
shame because we've
spending.
gone from a position of global leadership to less of one through what was announced.
I hear that, but we will still be spending more than most countries. 0.5% is more than France, much more than France spends, double what Italy and Spain spend. We'll still, I think we're going to be the second in the G7. It's not exactly going into the relegation zone, is it?
Well, we were global leaders, and we've been global leaders on this for some time, since, back at the Gleneagles Summit, when we were really leading the charge on global aid and debt and fair trade. And we've abandoned that position of leadership through this decision. So yes, you can compare to some other countries, and I'm sure you can find some who are spending less. But the truth
virtually
is,
all countries
we've
spend
abandoned
less.
a position of global leadership on it.
Okay. Miatta Fahnbulleh, let me come to you. Should we be looking at this in terms of proportion of GDP? 0.7% people will say is a very arbitrary figure to use. It is the UN recommended figure, it has to be said, and we have committed to this in legislation. But why not 0.5? Why not 0.9? Why 0.7?
Well, so I think the key thing is less the percentage and the principle that at some point we said we were going to peg the amount of aid that we gave to this level. Aid is the easiest thing to cut. It's the first thing that governments reach for. And I think it was right when we put in legislation and said, we're going to make this commitment because actually we recognize that we've got both a moral responsibility as an advanced country to help others, but also because of the huge power it gives us and the soft power it gives us. And as soon as you start chipping away at that principle that we should peg the amount of aid that we give to a certain amount, what you'll see is that over time it will just be chipped away. So it's 0.5% now. And by the way, because our economy has contracted, the actual total amount that we were giving was already going down, and we're pushing it down further. And, it seems very unlikely that actually the trajectory will be that aid will go up. It'll just continue going down, which I think is completely the wrong thing. There is a massive economic hit that we are facing because of this pandemic, but that hit is far more painful for countries in the global south, for example. And we have a collective responsibility and duty to make sure that we're trying to look after people. Aid does that. And by the way, if we don't do that, in an interconnected world, it rebounds back on us. So I think it's very short-sighted. And also I think it sends completely the wrong signal.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see what our two other panellists think about this. We'll have to wait just a moment. Also, if you've got a question that you'd like to put to the panel before 9 o'clock, 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC. It's 19 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:22, we're answering a question on foreign aid from Darius in Sutton. Harriett Baldwin, as somebody I've always thought of as a Cameroon conservative, you can't approve of this, surely?
Well, I was always very proud that we got to 0.7 and that we spent more than any Labour government ever did in terms of international aid. And I saw when I was Minister for Africa just what incredible good that does for our soft power in the world. It was a manifesto commitment this time last year when we launched the manifesto. So I personally am ashamed that this is the first thing that the Chancellor has targeted today. And I told him so in the Commons. I think that we can be proud that there's still going to be £10 billion spent in terms of international development aid, but we must recognise the fact that all of the very poorest countries are suffering an even worse economic shock. I got an update today from South Sudan. They've got not only COVID-19 and the economic shock, they've got conflict on the ground, they've got locust plagues, they've had floods, the worst floods, and so I feel that it's the wrong thing to be doing at this particular point in time to target the very poorest and break our promise to them.
What about the very poorest in this country, though? Because there are a lot of people who say charity begins at home. There are incredible pockets of poverty throughout the United Kingdom. Surely this money would be better spent at home. That's what people will say. Yeah,
and we, of course, have increased the amount that we are putting into the welfare system. I think a further $9 billion has gone into the welfare system during the pandemic. $2 or $3 billion, doesn't it? And I understand that this money is actually more going towards the defence budget, which, again, I think a lot of colleagues welcome. But what I would just feel about this is that it's the wrong time in terms of the need to get this vaccine to the very poorest countries. And we've got this Oxford vaccine, which is very affordable. And I know we're already making enormous pledges in terms of how much we're spending on the vaccine for the poorest countries. But I think this would be a fantastic opportunity for our soft power to get that to every poor country.
Okay. Peter Cardwell, are you going to defend Rishi Sunak on this?
I think it's a very interesting political decision which is dividing the Conservative Party already for what is, in the scheme of things, quite a small amount of money. £5 billion sounds like a lot, but in the scheme of the amount of money he's spending, I think we do get a little bit fixated on the percentage, 0.7. Under Gordon Brown, for example, it was 0.51. Under Tony Blair, I'm pretty sure it fell to the lowest ever percentage, which was 0.24. So we can get fixated on the percentage. It's still £10 billion. That's a lot of money. It's going to do a lot of good. But I think politically this is going to be very difficult for the government. It's going to look as if the Conservatives don't care, in a way that David Cameron was, of course, appealing to Liberal Democrat voters in 2015 and later. So it's a really interesting and probably quite problematic political decision. I think a lot of MPs are not going to vote for it.
You're sounding a bit on the fence to me.
I'm afraid I am a little bit on the fence on this one. I still think £10 billion is a lot of money. I agree with a lot of Harriet's points, but I also think a lot of people, especially Conservative voters in the Red Wall, for example, will say, why are we giving £5 billion away when we need it at home?
Right, let's thank you. Darius, just a quick word from you in reply.
Yeah, I'm speaking from a perspective. I was an engineer and director of a major UK consulting engineering contracting organisation responsible for securing contracts in the UK businesses for over 20 years. The key point I wanted to make, it is giving aid also brings great economic benefits to this country. British products are bought, British in all aspects. When British companies get work on an aid project, they predominantly purchase British products. When we educate foreign engineers, when qualified, they purchase British products. I've just returned from Africa, and as I saw the influence that the Chinese had got through giving aid and influence, and for politicians to suggest that getting contracts and trade agreements in these Commonwealth and Third World countries is going to be easy peasy, have no understanding of the market.
Okay, well, Darius, you stay listening, because after 9 o'clock on the show tonight, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this with Andrew Mitchell, the former International Development Secretary. He's going to be here for the whole hour to answer questions on foreign aid, so do stay around for that. Now, Henry in Surbiton has texted this question. Does the EHRC report on Windrush today confirm what we all knew, that the Home Office and this government is racist? You were Special Advisor to Amber Rudd. I believe in it. And didn't she task you with looking into Windrush? That ended well, didn't it?
It did. 3 weeks later, I was out of the Home Office. This government is absolutely...
So
and so was she, as a result of her being out of government, exactly. And this government is not racist. It never has been. I have...
Well, it's a Home Office racist.
And absolutely.
That's the accusation.
Absolutely not. I mean, there are problems in the Home Office, which we've seen in recent weeks, of course, and obviously the Priti Patel affair. There's absolutely no excuse for bullying. But what the report on her illustrated was a wider problem within the Home Office in terms of its functionality. That's been a problem for many years. Indeed, when your friend Jackie Smith was Home Secretary, it was a problem even back then. So I think the Home Office has a lot of problems, but it's not racist. I never met a single person at the Home Office who, properly disliked migrants or made any racist comments. That's an absurd suggestion. I think most civil servants, the vast majority of civil servants in this country, work in an impartial way to try to make life better for people.
Miatta Fahnbulleh, this report today is fairly damning. Do you believe that the Home Office or the government is racist in any way?
Well, I think when the report says this is a stain in our history, that is on the money and it's spot on. And I think, the Windrush scandal was an absolute disgrace. And the key point was we deliberately put in place an environment, a hostile environment, which targeted people, which marginalised them, the vans that were going through the streets of London saying go home, all of that, whether it was deliberately racist or not, does have the tone of racism. I think it's a complete shambles, quite frankly. And I think the thing that really gets me is we had the apology around the Windrush. The hope was that actually what we'd see from the Home Office was reacting and responding sensitively, showing that they'd learnt the lessons. But even the way the compensation scheme has been managed, the pace at which it's happening, the delay, the dither, the insecurity it's causing to lots of people suggests we haven't learnt the lessons enough. And quite frankly, the hostile environment and the tone and culture that sits around it still imbues our immigration policy. And that's wrong. It is a stain in our history and we need to change it.
Harriett Baldwin, it's something for somebody to accuse the Home Office and the government of being racist. But the Windrush scandal, and indeed you could argue many aspects of our immigration policy, can lead people to think that there is racism involved here.
Well, I think that there are people who want to paint the policy that way, and I think that the Windrush scandal, has rightly been acknowledged as a scandal, and process is underway to rectify that. But I think what the British public want is they want, a fair immigration system. They want the Home Office, and I pay tribute to the amazing civil servants who implement the policies that the British public want. They want a fair immigration system that allows people to come here, and we just brought in the Immigration Act and the points-based system to make a contribution to our country. I want to be a welcoming country, and wants to make sure that anyone here who's here illegally is not here, and that should not be a racist process. That should be a legal process, one which I think a lot of people work extremely hard on getting right.
Pat McFadden, what needs to change?
Well, I think the best way to look at this is to consider it from the point of view of the people that are affected. And they were treated as illegal immigrants when they weren't illegal immigrants, and many of them had been here since childhood and were now in their 50s or 60s or more, and suddenly found themselves, and quite a lot of MPs had experience of this in our advice surgeries, suddenly people are retiring and finding themselves denied access to benefits and other things, and sometimes health treatment and all this kind of thing. And we ended up treating people in a very inhuman way and threatening them with deportation back to countries that they really had no connection with anymore. Britain was their home, and our government was saying, it's not your home. And it was their home. They'd made their lives here. They had worked here all their lives. They paid their taxes. They paid their dues. So from a human point of view, this is an appalling story, and I've met people who've been involved in it myself, and just this sheer sense of bewilderment is something that we should really care about. It was a terrible way to treat people, and to go to the start of your question, these were black people from Caribbean islands. You've got to ask yourself, do we think they would have been treated like that if they'd been from somewhere else? There's a pretty good chance they wouldn't have been.
OK, we'll come to more of your questions in just a minute. If you'd like to join in our conversation, 0345 6060 973. And don't forget, you can watch us on Global Player or the LBC YouTube, Facebook and Twitter feeds. It's 8:33. Let's get the LBC News headlines from Rachel Gerrish.
The Chancellor has revealed we're only at the start of the economic emergency caused by coronavirus, as he announced record peacetime borrowing to help the country survive the crisis. Nearly £300 billion has been spent so far. Rishi Sunak has forecasted the biggest drop in output for 300 years. So, as part of his spending review, a public sector pay freeze was announced, although not for NHS workers. But the decision to cut foreign aid to save billions has led to criticism. Government Minister Baroness Sugg has resigned over it. And there are going to be 3 days of national mourning in Argentina to remember footballing legend Diego Maradona. The World Cup winner, regarded by many as the greatest player of all time, has died of a heart attack at the age of 60. There have been silences held in all of tonight's Champions League matches in his honour. And the weather, it will be cloud and rain clearing tonight. Most of England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. Chilly with frost and freezing fog patches. Lows of -3 in Scotland, 3 in the southeast of England. From Global's newsroom, I'm Rachel Gerrish.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:37 on LBC. You're listening to Cross Question, or watching Cross Question, hopefully, as well. With me, Harriett Baldwin, former Treasury and Foreign Office Minister. Peter Cardwell, who's written a book called The Secret Life of Special Advisors. He was Special Advisor predominantly to James Brokenshire when he was Northern Ireland Secretary. Miatta Fahnbulleh is from the New Economics Foundation, and Pat McFadden is a Labour MP, and he is Labour's Shadow Treasury spokesman. Let's go to your next question. It's from Chris in Richmond. Hi, Chris. What would you like to ask?
Hi, Ian, and hi, panel. By Boris Johnson keeping Priti Patel in her job, has the government shown that simply bullying is fair game in the workplace?
Peter, let me come to you first, because you were sacked by Dominic Cummings, weren't you? Was there any bullying going on there?
No, Dominic didn't bully me at all, and unfortunately, for a lot of people, I actually still have quite a lot of respect for him and think he actually achieved a huge amount as a special advisor, probably more than many ministers. In regard to Priti Patel, there's absolutely no excuse for bullying in the workplace. There never can be at all. The report, of course, said that she didn't intend to bully people, but that was nonetheless the effect. I think she has to reflect on that. She, of course, apologised unreservedly for it. And Boris Johnson faces a very stark choice in the reshuffle that we're led to believe maybe in January or at some stage next year in terms of whether he moves her. She's an incredibly popular politician. She's someone who I think would actually do a brilliant job as chairperson of the party, for example. And I remember talking to a former chairperson of the Conservative Party who said that he was often going out to places and they said, well, it's great to see you, but we'd kind of rather have Priti Patel. So she has a very particular role within the Conservative Party. I think Boris Johnson probably needs her in a senior role. Her apology didn't come across particularly well for a lot of people. There's a lot of criticism of that, and I go back to saying that bullying is never needed and never excusable. What I would say, as someone who worked in the Home Office for a very, very short period of time, a matter of weeks, is that it is clearly, as Windrush has shown in the report today, the Home Office is a dysfunctional place. The report also showed that the Home Office civil servants were not supporting Priti Patel in the way that she should have been supported, and I think everybody needs to take a bit of a step back and think about how both the political side and the civil service side of the Home Office works to make it a better functionality, which I think is increased under its new Permanent Secretary, Matthew Rycroft.
Harriett Baldwin, Boris Johnson said he won't put up with bullying, but he has put up with bullying, hasn't he? Here, you came into Parliament, I think, in the same intake as Priti Patel. Should she still be in her job?
Yeah, I'm very proud of what she's achieved as well, and she's always been an absolutely charming colleague. I've not seen the side of her which clearly got very, very frustrated at times, and she's acknowledged and put on record her apologies for that. But I think she's a remarkable politician, extremely popular in terms of what she's delivering on behalf of the electorate. I mentioned already the Immigration Act. I think incredibly important increases in terms of the number of police and so on. And so I think, could I honestly swear hand on heart? I've never lost my temper, never uttered a swear word. I couldn't, Ian, and I'm not sure whether. And I think she's apologised, and I think we should accept that apology.
I suppose, Pat McFadden, bullying is a word which I suspect we'd all have slightly different definitions of. Losing your temper on the odd occasion with different people, I'm not sure that counts as bullying, but as a persistent campaign against somebody maybe who is maybe at a slightly lower level, that is. From what you've read, from what you've heard, do you think that she is guilty of bullying as we would normally understand it?
Politics it can be a high stress environment, and ministers can feel under great pressure. And to be honest, I think most officials understand that. So I go to what Harriett said there. Yeah, I think, there's probably in most ministers' careers times when they've really felt under stress. Maybe they've been a bit hard on somebody. But from what I hear and what I read, this is pretty well beyond that. And it sounds like it was a pattern that it continued for some time. And I've got a lot of respect for Alex Allen, the guy who wrote the report. And the problem for the government in this is not just whether she should have gone or not. I think she should have. It was a clear breach of the ministerial code. Ministers should go if that happens. But there's another thing going on here, which is the notion around Boris Johnson It goes back to this, all that Dominic Cummings business as well, that rules don't really apply to them. That rules are for someone else. And that's a bad impression to have at the top of government. And the problem about the way this Priti Patel situation has been handled is it has reinforced the impression that that's really what Boris thinks, that rules are not really for the likes of him, they're for somebody else.
Miatta.
Yeah, look, I think she should have gone. I mean, it's quite a big deal when an independent advisor says that a minister has broken the ministerial code. I think it reflects really badly on the Prime Minister because it suggests that the standards of office that we should expect of our elected politicians, he doesn't really care that much about, and he's willing to kind of dismiss. And, you know, in the end, I was a civil servant. If you have a minister that can't articulate themselves and what they want properly, if you have a minister that intimidates and bullies, they're not a very effective minister. They're not getting stuff done. You can't get your civil servants to work for you properly because you're throwing hissy fits rather than being clear about what you want and having a proper conversation and dialogue based on mutual respect. So on that grounds alone, she should go. But critically, she broke the ministerial code. She's got to go.
Well, as somebody who's never had a hissy fit in his life, I think we'll call that one to a conclusion, shall we? Right, we're going to take more of your calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's coming up to 8:45.
This is LBC. Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:48. I'm going to issue our panel with a challenge because I want to get in 3 different subjects over the next 12 minutes. So brief answers, please. Let's take this text from Denise in Lancashire, who says, I'm in the forces. I've missed Christmas in the past to keep our country safe. Isn't it best for all of us to do that this year to save our loved ones from coronavirus rather than this ridiculous easing? Pat McFadden, have the government been too lax? I mean, the 4 different governments throughout the United Kingdom, they've all agreed this 3 household bubble for 5 days. Does that get your support, or do you think they've been a bit too lax?
Well, I think it's about how we see this. When I see a lot of these newspaper headlines about let's save Christmas or is Christmas saved, I think it's not the way to look at this. We've had such exciting news in recent weeks about a vaccine. I understand that people will want to see immediate relatives and so on at Christmas. And of course, we all understand that. But I think it would be an enormous mistake with a vaccine in sight to let our guard down and to really go over the top. So I think it is, even with the relaxation that the government in Scotland and so on have announced, it's going to be a different kind of Christmas, and it's in all our interest to still remember that this virus is out there over the Christmas period. As I think it was the Prime Minister himself said, the virus doesn't know or care that it's Christmas. So yes, the rules have relaxed a wee bit, but let's remember we're still in a public health emergency here.
Harriett Baldwin, Nicola Sturgeon said, just because you can doesn't mean to say that you should. Should the government be issuing a slightly grinchy message over the next few weeks, almost trying to discourage people from meeting up in those kind of numbers, even though they've said that it's acceptable? Because if we get to the middle of January and the infection rates start rising again, no doubt people will say, well, they shouldn't have done it.
I really sometimes have to pinch myself in this crisis that we're relying on the government to tell us who we can see on what day of the year. And there was an edict put out last week that we can actually buy our Christmas tree. And I thought, goodness me, this is extraordinary. I actually think it should be down to the individual responsibility in each family. And every family is going to be different. I think the government's been wise to accept that actually over those days at Christmas, it would have been impossible to enforce, and that you couldn't really have our police going out after every single family that wanted to get together for Christmas. So I think they've come down with the right sort of guidance, but I think it should be up to every individual to decide what's right for their family and not feel obliged if they think it's a risk to, as Pat says, anticipate the oncoming vaccine.
Miatta.
So I think this is a difficult one for the government. I think my personal view is we have an end in sight with the vaccine, with the prospect of rolling it out going into next year. And so, there's a period of time by which our priority should just be suppressing the virus. And when you hear the scientists, they're very clear that, easing off for a few days over Christmas does risk a third spike. And that feels like quite a big risk for me, given that it's as painful. Of course, we all want to see our families, but we are just in this for a little bit longer, and it kind of feels like we should hold on tight.
Peter.
I'd like to thank Denise and all her fellow servicemen and women who serve so bravely throughout the year, and particularly at Christmas. There are many people who give up that very cherished family time to keep our country moving in our hospitals and many, many other places. I think it would be inconceivable for the UK not to be together at Christmas. I think I was very, very glad to see the 4 nations of the UK and the various devolved administrations working together to come up with a proper policy on this. I think there should be more of that because some, certainly I haven't been impressed with what Nicola Sturgeon has been doing in terms of getting out in front too quickly and not coordinating. I think it's very good that this policy is there. I also think, as Harriett correctly points out, that most people will have made their own choice anyway. It's completely unenforceable. So I think that the fact that we have strong guidance on this, that there is a very clear suggestion and guidance from government in terms of what people should do, is hopefully what people will be responsible and will follow during this Christmas period.
And I should say, if you'd like to hear more from Peter, he's on the Iain Dale All Talk podcast today, 45 minutes talking about his life in politics and indeed his book, The Secret Life of Special Advisors. Thanks, Denise, for that text. Let's move on to a caller, Richard in Bristol. Hi, Richard.
Good evening. Hi. There's going to be a huge bill to pay and lots of businesses to revitalise in our country. Is now the time the government goes after big companies like Amazon and all those offshore companies that aren't paying their fair share of taxes and retrieve a proper tax recoup to help pay for what's been happening?
Miatta, what's your reaction to that? Do you think the government should be going after big companies and soaking the rich?
So I don't think necessarily going after the big companies, but we do know that there are certain companies that have made, above profits, above what you'd expect in terms of profits during the pandemic. And therefore, I think there is a case for thinking back and thinking about retrospective windfall tax to pay for some of this. But I think there's a kind of bigger piece, which is we are going to have to think about ways in which we consolidate the books. Not now, because I think the priority has to be to get the economy working and to recover, but it's absolutely critical that we do that in the most progressive way. And so, I think it's actually a good thing that the government has been thinking about wealth taxes and other taxes so that we can better balance the tax burden between those that can pay more and those that can't. That will have to be part of the mix. But, there are a lot of companies that are getting away with not paying their fair share, and it's wrong. And when we need everyone to pull their belt in order to deal with both, the amount that we've had to spend through the pandemic, but critically, the amount that I hope we continue spending after the pandemic to ensure that, to quote the government's word, we build back better, we will need to think about, how everyone pays their fair share in that.
Harriett Baldwin, you've been a Treasury Minister. When George Osborne was Chancellor, he trumpeted the fact that he was going after tax avoiders. But the moment you get one, they find a loophole elsewhere. Why is it so difficult to get massive companies to pay what most people would consider to be their fair share?
Well, and the scale of this issue is quite extraordinary. I agree with Miatta that this is not the time to raise taxes. We want the economy to recover fully. And there is going to come a time, though, when we're going to have to figure out how we pay for it all. And frankly, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, all of their wealth combined wouldn't pay for the large hole in the spending this year in just the UK. So we're going to have to think of other approaches. Amazon, there was a tax brought in this year, in this year's Finance Act, that has increased the amount of tax on them. I'm on the Treasury Select Committee. We're doing a report at the moment called Tax After Coronavirus. So if Richard wants to write into it, we'd be very welcome to receive his evidence. But I think there are some things that really do frustrate me. For example, if you're a duke in this country and incredibly wealthy, but just happen to be over the age of a pension starting, you'll get the winter fuel allowance. I think that's crazy. Well,
it is crazy, but if you close that, you probably, I don't know, get £10 million for the Exchequer or something. It's a piddling little amount, isn't it, compared to
every member of the House of Lords who's over a certain age will be getting a free bus pass. I think there are some things that look to me pretty difficult to justify in this environment, because we are going to have to find a way to, I hope, through strong economic recovery, but even once we've done that, there will be a legacy impact, and I think taxation is going to be one of the things that the Chancellor will have to look at.
Peter?
I think we've got to, certainly people should pay their fair share. There are a lot of people paid a lot of money to try to, by these companies, to get them to pay as little tax as possible. What I think, especially with Amazon, and I'm guilty of using Amazon very, very often, I think there needs to be a level playing field in terms of high streets. I think high streets have really suffered in this country in the last 10 or 20 years, especially in regard to coronavirus. And we need to encourage people to get out there, support local, and to go to local cafes, bookshops, etc., to support those, because they will disappear. And people talk about the kind of clone towns that were there previously. You walk along and you see Boots, W. Smith, etc., and even those places are closing because people aren't supporting the high street. So I think we need to refocus our energies on that.
Okay, Pat McFadden.
Well, we're still in the phase of, if you view this as kind of war and peace, we're still very much in the phase of trying to support the economy through it, and that's what we've got to keep doing for the moment. And to go back to where we started tonight, the Chancellor's figures showed us today just how much that's costing, and we'll be paying it back for a long time, for decades to come. The thing about taxation, I think, is not so much to target companies on the basis of size, but to make sure that people pay their fair share. And there's certainly been the perception in recent years that for multinational companies, and particularly digital ones, it's been too easy to transfer profits around to convenient jurisdictions and so on, and that they've been able to avoid taxes in a way that hasn't been true of bricks and mortar physical businesses. So there is an issue there for governments right around the world about how you tax big multinational companies like that. But I do stress, at the moment, in the phase that we're in right now, the key task for government is to support the country through this, because if we don't do that, the long-term economic costs will be higher in the long run.
OK. Right, final text here from Travis in Kent. Diego Maradona has died today at the age of 60, and many would consider him to be a football hero. Who is your hero, and who do you look up to? Peter.
My hero is my Aunt Esther, who is in her 70s.
I have an Aunt Esther.
Do you? Right. She moved from Surbiton to Sydney, Australia in the last few years, and she is someone who just has bears real, I'm completely agnostic, but she bears real Christian witness. She helps people who are homeless. She helps out in the church. She's just a lovely person, and I think she does great work. And she's
all hail Auntie Esther, I say. Miatta Fahnbulleh.
Okay, so I'm going to go for the Prime Minister of New Zealand because I think she's shown... I thought you were going to
say the Prime Minister Boris Johnson there for a moment.
Christ, you, Iain. I think she's shown a different kind of feminist leadership. I think the way that she, for example, has handled the corona crisis, but actually just the way she governs, the sorts of policies she puts in place are really inspirational. I think a lot of our leaders can learn from a new generation of young female leaders.
Pat McFadden.
Well, I agree with Miatta actually about if there was a World Cup of Prime Ministers at the moment, Jacinda Ardern would win it for me. But if you're asking about favourite footballers of the present day, I would go for Kieran Tierney. He's a player I've loved for many years, so he's my current favourite footballer.
OK, well, not necessarily a favourite footballer, Harriett. Who's your hero?
Well, I'll say it's just over 100 years since women were first able to stand for Parliament in this country. So for every woman who's ever stood for public office, wherever in the world, let's get to a 50-50 Parliament in the UK in our lifetime.
You can't say that they're all your heroes. You've got to pick one.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, we'll start with the first one then, Nancy Astor, who got elected.
Right, well, thank you all very much for joining us. Pat McFadden, Miatta Fahnbulleh, Peter Cardwell and Harriett Baldwin. We'll be back next week with another edition of Cross Question. Coming up after the 9 o'clock news, Andrew Mitchell, the former International Development Secretary, will be joining me in the studio to take your calls on this decision today to reduce the level of international development spending from 0.7% of gross domestic product to 0.5%. I'm sure a lot of you will have very strong views on that on both sides of the argument. Your opportunity to get them off your chest in just a moment. You're listening to LBC. It's 1 minute past 9.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the Chancellor says we're only at the start of the economic emergency caused by coronavirus. But NHS staff will get a pay rise. Other public sector workers like teachers, firefighters and police won't